list of development economists that she put together to help with the development and integration of the Caribbean community. I got to witness firsthand her vision for how economic integration can help small economies thrive. Now, you're here to listen to Prime Minister Mottley, not to me. So I will leave it there. I just say we are blessed to have with us today an electrifying speaker. But let me also say that we are very lucky to have our moderator, Ambassador Atalia Molokome of Botswana, a distinguished legal scholar and judge who has served her country as Attorney General for 11 years before coming here. She currently chairs the WTO's dispute settlement body and co-chairs the informal working group on women and trade. So without much ado, let me call on Prime Minister Mottley to take the floor.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, my sister, for those very kind words. All you've done is to explain why I've gotten so great in such a short space of time. Director General Tatiana Valovaya, my brother, Director General Tedros, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, my sister, Secretary General Rebecca. I know she had to leave to go to a meeting with the UN Secretary General, and in your absence, we will be here. I really want distinguished guests all and all who are listening. I really want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. And let me first, Madam Director General, congratulate you on all of the work that you have been doing and the leadership that you provided at this most critical time for the world, given all of the challenges that we are facing. We are confident that your erudition, but also your experience and your heart will make all of the difference that we need now. Because if the WTO is to remain faithful to its mandate and to bring prosperity and stability to the people of this world, and to ensure that international trade does not have the obstacles that it has now, then your work must be a success, buttressed by all of our cooperation, by keeping a higher purpose in front of us. I'd also like to thank you for the honor that you've bestowed on my country by inviting me to deliver this lecture this afternoon. And this is the inaugural Presidential Lecture, and Barbados is truly humbled by our opportunity to share perspectives from a small island developing state, because our voice is critical in this debate, since in many instances we are on the front line of these challenging times. The very existence of our states depends on a few things, but the one existential crisis that we all face is that of climate. And indeed, you will therefore forgive me, all of you, please, I ask for your forgiveness, if at this juncture I share with you that I would like to dedicate this lecture to someone who I knew all my life, but who regrettably passed on Friday evening, Dr. Hugh Seeley, who was the lead negotiator on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States with respect to Article 6 coming out of the Paris Agreement. His loss will be not just that of small island developing states, but the void that he leaves will be felt by all who fight to save this planet Earth, for his voice was at the front line of that for the last 20 years. My friends, underlying the theme before us today is the recognition that the global order is not working. It simply is not delivering in the areas of critical importance necessary to achieve the goal of sustainable development for the majority of our world's population. And I want to submit to you that it is not achieving for our people, as still too many people in this world live in conditions of hunger, of poverty, of indignity, and of inequality. If we are to achieve prosperity for all, then we must really try, because if not, it will remain a distant aspiration, far too distant for too many, and let alone those who have no access to technology or who have not been able to benefit from social cohesion within their countries. Simply, we are not delivering for our planet either, as daily widespread climate degradation, whether in the form of droughts or in the form of floods and hurricanes, continue to undermine our capacity to support both the present and future generations. Similarly, we are not achieving the objective of partnership beyond the words that are used by many. We use the word partnership glibly, but where is the example of it? For my friends, greed continues, regrettably, to motivate too many, that we are more concerned with generating profits than saving people is perhaps the greatest condemnation that can be made of our generation globally. We continue to have a world that is segregated, regrettably, between those who came first, in whose image the global order is now set. And I really had promised not to use this phrase, but I have to deviate, that regrettably, we are seeing a global order in which we live that is simply the embalming of the old colonial order that existed at the time of the establishment of these institutions. And we have therefore to ask ourselves whether we are in a position to deliver on the peace that would permit us all to live in a just and inclusive society in each of our countries, or whether we are in fact creating a world where peace is elusive, peace both in terms of security, but also peace that comes from economic justice. And we have therefore to ask ourselves whether therefore we can live in this global order. And what am I saying? As is suggested by the very theme before us, we know that a transformative agenda is required. Absolutely, but it depends on all of us. And the question therefore must be, are we ready to exercise the global moral leadership, the commitment and the political will necessary strategically that will allow us to pursue the transformative agenda in order for us to be able to reinvent the global order? My friends, a global order, regrettably, today perpetuates the first and the second class countries, of which I spoke in Accra, and in fact, not in Accra, on the Cape Coast 2 Sundays ago, largely because that is our reality. We have faced a world that has cemented the right of a few to determine the fate of the rest of us. Is that acceptable to any of us in our families, in our communities, or in our countries? And if it is not acceptable in our families, in our communities, and in our countries, I submit to you that it has no place in the global order. The ultimate absurdity of what I'm saying is amplified when we look at the arrangements that led to the P5 within the context of the Security Council. How do 5 countries have the right to veto that which others want to see happen? Similarly, how do we understand that in our world, there must always be somebody to guard the guard? In the Caribbean, we ask it simply, who gonna guard the guard? If there is no one looking over those who claim to have that superior voice and superior wisdom, then who protects the rest of us? My friends, this is a global order that is compromising equally our right to development, our right and ability and capacity to attain the sustainable development goals that each and every one of our countries has submitted is critical for our populations in order for them to prosper. If we don't recognize that the time is now for us to find solutions with respect to long-term financing instruments, not 5, 10, 15, 20, 50, 70, and 80, in the same way that Britain and other countries were required to find them as they went forward in a post-World War world, where they recognized that they could not pursue development at the same time as they had to service the debts of the war. It is no different for the rest of our countries who battle now the pandemic, who battle now the climate crisis, and who must now battle the consequences of war in Europe. Simply put, if we have to service that debt that we have incurred in the last 2 years, then we do not have the position and the capacity to borrow to finance our development with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. It will become an illusion, regrettably, for many. I pause also at this point to reflect that post-World War II, the advanced countries of the world agreed that Germany should not have to service debt in excess of 5% of their exports. But yet today, in our own countries, in small island developing states, that number is in excess of 30%. I ask simply, where is the justice that we speak of? I could go further and refer to the letter that was in the Guardian newspaper only 2 days ago that calls on the world to reflect on whether or not Ukraine's debt should not be completely written off, given the humanitarian tragedy that that country is facing. But I ask us to not forget that they are not the first country to have faced such humanitarian crises. And if we are going to open our hearts to the concept of how we treat the issue of debt and financing, then I say now is the time for the long-term instruments to be able to reflect the horror of what so many of us have endured during the course of the last 2 years. A pandemic compounded by a climate crisis is nothing to play with. Regrettably also, we continue to ignore the voices of other developing countries in the same way that we ignore the voice of labor, the workers, our citizens, on so many issues globally, when in most instances, what are they really trying to do? To make requests that are morally just. To make requests that are morally just. As you know, in the WTO, labor's voice has been insistent on the need for social dialogue to ensure that our trade policy that we settle upon reflects the interests of all, and that there be a just floor for competition that enforces labor and environmental standards for whom? Not for aliens, but for ordinary people in whose interests we are committed to serve. So as we consider this question, I want to suggest, as we all know, that the invasion of Ukraine has in fact reset the global order. The old one, I've shown enough, is simply not working. Not delivering on peace, not delivering on prosperity, not delivering on stability. And indeed, we do so because the events of recent times literally come after 20 years of what? A global financial crisis. The release of unprecedented amounts of liquidity, a rapid climate change and climate-related disaster world, or as I like to call it, a climate crisis in which we find ourselves, a COVID-19 pandemic, and without prejudice to all of that, the work that we are now doing to avert the next pandemic, the slow motion pandemic on antimicrobial resistance, which you referred to earlier, that I'm working along with the WHO and Dr. Tedros to be able to see how we can fight the superviruses that are already killing in excess of 1 million people annually and is expected to kill more people by 2050 than any other condition. My friends, while we have not had what some call a world war, we have truly had a world of wars, a world of conflicts, where millions of innocent victims, civilians, have been the casualties. It's a shame that it takes this European theater to make us respond to the illegal state aggression with global sanctions. It is a shame that it takes this theater to provide the warm welcome to refugees, a welcome which ought to have been our human response to all refugees all along, and not just today. But nevertheless, better late than never. For the plight of migrants is not one that they accept willingly. It is one that is foisted on them because of circumstances beyond their control, irrespective of whether those circumstances come from climate or man-made causes. My friends, it is no wonder that many of our young people globally have lost faith in this order, in this global order, because of what they view as patent hypocrisy. I've been in public life through many of these swirling, unsure times, and my life has witnessed firsthand, yes, the failure of the international order to respond where we need it to respond most. The countries and global and regional institutions should have listened to the canaries, which we consider ourselves as small island developing states, long time ago. But regrettably, we are now at risk of disappearing or dying because of the confluence of events that the world now sees. Unimpeded, nations will choose greater financial, energy, food, and national security by retreating behind national and regional lines of defense. That's what I referred to last year. And regrettably, rather than us seeing an improvement in our circumstances, we have seen the circumstances literally worsen before our very eyes. The inconvenient truth for those of us who support a liberal international order is that maybe some good may come from crisis. Maybe. We may develop a diversified and therefore more robust financial system if we finally listen about the need for different instruments that are appropriate to the conditions in which most of our countries find ourselves. We hope that it will also accelerate the pace of the transition to renewable energy, because we know what fossil fuels alone will do, although we are conscious too that the discussion is nuanced and that a net zero world does not mean a fossil fuel free world, but simply one where fossil fuels don't exceed more than 20% of the overall mix. And that carries us into other discussions that I don't have time today to deal with. Similarly, we have to determine whether we are going to eat healthier and less processed foods, because we have to eat fresher food because of the supply disruption that is now upon us with the global supply chain. There will be better results for our bodies, I suspect, than if we had continued to eat the processed foods. But a contradiction in all of this is that would this be a defeat of internationalism? At a time when we need internationalism and multilateralism more than ever? Can we achieve those other things without having to accept that the only route to them is through the defeat of multilateralism? I believe that we can. And we cannot, therefore, retreat from that internationalism, even if in some instances it requires us to take difficult decisions that we might not otherwise be willing to take. There is no safety behind the Maginot Line, none whatsoever. And in an inclusive international trading system that we all accept is critical to solving many of the problems we face, we then must ask ourselves, how do we move from this position today? I want to share with you in a few minutes, very briefly, my thoughts on the role of trade in the solutions to two of the most significant transitions facing humanity, and to look at how the WTO can be and must be in the vanguard of that change that we all need. A comment on the absolute need for us to bring the architecture of a new global order to the 21st century, one that is transparent, that is fair, and that is rooted in moral legitimacy. One of the most profound transitions facing the world that we live in today is the rise of the new digital empires. You have to call them empires. The world carries out an increasing proportion of its trade on digital platforms. And the digital trade changes the geography of trade and allows for the high mobility of people, technology, and services. The digital world is highly concentrated. There are essentially 9 leading digital platforms. Using their brand names, what are they? Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Google, IBM, Microsoft, Tencent, Baidu, and Alibaba. Even more striking, these 9 are also essentially owned and controlled by a small handful of individuals. These are companies that are now today more powerful than the 7 sisters were when those conglomerates were broken up almost a century ago. Never before has the global economy seen so much concentration of economic power in so few hands. And there's a paradox to blame. Though a few individuals have benefited astronomically, their business model is shaped by what? By the state's data governance models. The business model is that the firms must provide free services in return for freely using the user's data. It has been called third-party funded barter. And this model exists in China too, though with greater collaboration between the state and the companies, at least explicitly. So whether deliberately or not, what is the reality here in Europe? Europe disrupts this model through its data privacy laws. To some extent, they shift data ownership from the platform back to the user. The larger the market, the more value that free data has to those who assemble products from that data. There are substantial economies of scale. Considering these two issues, the data governance model and the economies of scale, it is no surprise that 6 of the 9 big tech firms that I just referred to are in the United States and 3 are in China. And none of the 9 is anywhere else. None. The business model follows the regulatory model. And so if the data governance model does not change, more or less, this is the way that it will be. An increasing proportion for global trade then is determined by the ability of consumers and producers to access an oligopoly of the US and Chinese platforms and consent to their rules and conventions around data governance, delivery, and payments. The space and opportunity to be outside of these digital platforms, my friends, is shrinking. Suppose a teleworker, an app designer, or a service provider from a developing country were to try to access these platforms. In that case, they will first face challenges around payment systems, which stem partly from the uneven application of anti-money laundering rules, leading to the sharp narrowing of correspondent bank servicing in developing countries. We in developing countries have been talking about the loss of correspondent banking capacity for years, and that you cannot live in this world without having access to banking services. If not, you are literally a leper or a pariah. But yet, the world takes glee almost in passing and putting all kinds of lists, the consequences of which are to put our countries literally on their knees with respect to access to banking and financial services. You cannot have exclusion of people on the basis of this without causing serious damage to human beings and trade in our small countries. They and others will have to become part of, and I refer to all of the persons who want to use these fees and these digital platforms, they will have to become part of and pay fees for being part of an oligopolistic payment network, such as Visa and MasterCard, ubiquitous and all about. They may have to pay hefty fees to be on the digital platform and then subscribe to their data rules to confirm that data governance is a trade issue. That's what it is. If a country wanted to use fiscal measures to incentivize those using other data rules to redress the concentration of one business model resulting from the US data governance model, they cannot. There is now a WTO moratorium, I'm told, Madam Director General, on all taxes on digital commerce. Yet, this is still all highly distortionary and discriminatory, largely beyond WTO scrutiny and the future of international commerce. One of our most urgent challenges as well is the climate crisis. It cannot be avoided. It is an existential crisis, not just for small island developing states, but for all of us on this planet. And it is just a question who is affected first. My country lies on the front line, as you know, between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. But many of you in this room also come from countries that lie between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. We have contributed little to the stock of greenhouse gases. And I refer not simply to those who contribute today daily, but I refer to the stock of greenhouse gases that has literally driven modern development from the industrial age. And in spite of that minimal contribution, the temperatures and the sea levels continue to provide significant damage to our countries and to our people, where, for example, a drought can happen and half of our country be outside of access to potable water for months at a time, where, for example, in the Caribbean, a country's entire GDP can be wiped out in a night, or in the case of Dominica, 227% of its GDP with Hurricane Maria and Irma, where our national debts have been driven to be amongst the highest globally by expenditures on environmental protection and mopping up after climate-related disasters. And I want to pause here a second, because many assume that we have, small island developing states and developing countries, have large debt stocks purely because of corruption and profligacy, when in truth and in fact, the work that has been done and is being done by UNCTAD is also showing, and in the CARICOM region, is showing more and more that a lot of that debt has come as a result of, one, the climate crisis. And Madam DG, I have to say this, although many may not want to hear it, that since the establishment of this august institution and its failure to accept the need for special and differential treatment, that our countries have also seen significant contraction in our domestic productive capacity in industry, in manufacturing, and in agriculture, largely as a result of the people who occupy this room not being able to accept that there truly is a genuine trigger for those countries that will not distort global trade in goods and services. And what have been the results? Before coming in here this afternoon, I asked my Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs and Industry to check the figures. And the reality is that since 1997, we have seen a contraction of our domestic manufacturing sector in Barbados decline by over 1/3, and our domestic agricultural sector decline by over 20%. What has been the impact of countries like ours on global trade in goods and services? Well, our share in global trade in goods is 0.000%, and our share of global trade in services is 0.0001%. So when you combine that across the board, it cannot be difficult to distinguish between those countries that can truly distort and those countries for whom the lash is just too heavy a burden, leading to that highly indebted set of circumstances to which I referred. My friends, rich industrialized countries telling poor countries and less industrialized nations that they should care more for the environment will not solve the climate crisis problem. Indeed, our ability to be able to spend money on mitigation and adaptation is constrained by that simple absence of fiscal space that has been triggered by the highly indebted condition that we have developed and come to accept for the last 3 decades in particular. It will not be solved, the climate crisis that is, by an economic system based on prices determined by today's supply and demand with inadequate regard for the future. And we will not solve it by techno-optimism and some loose change being thrown at people. The world needs to spend about $3 trillion a year on investments to transition to renewable and regenerative energy, transport, and agriculture. And the more we talk about it and the less we do it, the more critical the problem becomes. The amount of money, though, is not the biggest challenge. Because in the last 12 years alone, as I said at Glasgow, central banks have spent $25 trillion buying government bonds in their quantitative easing programs. If they had purchased $25 trillion of bonds that finance the energy transition, they would have had similar economic impact and got us halfway up the mountain in halting the climate crisis. But they didn't. So we're stuck at base camp because of our aim and an absence of an appropriate financing mechanism. I proposed, as you said, one at COP26, where we would look to have 500 billion in SDRs allocated for a period of 20 years. Since then, we've had quiet conversations in the margins of the G20, because the G20 does not represent us, as you know, even though there are calls for the G21 with Africa with 1.4 billion people being left out. That would make it more just and appropriate. or their calls for the G30 by 2030. But that's another discussion for another day too. But what we've discovered is that even if the sum of 500 billion in SDRs annually for 20 years appears to be a bridge too far, then we should at least settle on the first 500 billion, which in lending to the private sector could unlock at least another $2 to $3 trillion needed to get the ball rolling. And if it proves to be successful, then we go at it again and again and again until we can settle the world's preparation for this climate crisis through our ability to mitigate and to adapt accordingly. We know that the newly issued and unused special drawing rights are there, and that the trust that we can establish can use and draw from these special drawing rights would use, as I said, to unlock other funds for projects that can transform energy, transport, and agriculture as a matter of urgency to stem the crisis which we face. The 500 billion funds of low-cost financing would effectively be that fillip to private capital. Special drawing rights allow the world, as I said, to responsibly mobilize for safe investments in our future. And that $12 trillion of central bank reserves that are being kept dry for a rainy day, well, what is it? It is a rainy day, and it is time to use them. I hope, therefore, that we can continue to build support on these measures, on this idea, with those of you in the G20 countries and those of you who, like us, are outside of the G20, but who are truly concerned about what we are doing. Let us also consider quickly the trade aspects of this solution. We could halt the climate crisis fastest if someone with the right ideas, skills, and experience in one country could, with the help of a very low-cost funds from the Climate Mitigation Trust, raise additional capital that they need in another country where it is cheapest, buy the technology somewhere else where it is best, and turn to another place to invest where there is the greatest scope for climate mitigation. That's what this organization was set up to help us do. In building our coalition for change, we want those countries with capital to be united in common cause with those with technology and climate mitigation opportunities. For if we cannot bridge all three, we will not solve the problems and create opportunities for all. Those of us on the front line, we need grants for the loss and damage of climate events. We've been talking about the Warsaw Mechanism on loss and damage, but nothing more has come other than talk. Similarly, we need the concessionary loans to build resilience to the events. And as I said earlier, because of our highly indebted nature, we need the fiscal space as well. If not, the concessional loans will be a pot of gold on the other side of the rainbow, never to be attained by us. So my friends, as it relates now also to mitigation, those were for adaptation. But as it relates to mitigation, we need more than that where it is now. And regrettably, we continue to make promises, but not see those promises materialize into reality fast enough to stop the temperatures rising as they are. But to think about international trade, let me share with you what someone in a developing country will tell you about where it will happen from their experience about the trade obstacles they face. In the name of fighting global crime, the uneven application of anti-money laundering rules means that while billionaires are allowed to buy football clubs or to buy urban palaces in New York and London and Zurich, and to have the vast majority of their wealth there, many emerging market entrepreneurs from our countries cannot open a bank account, or cannot raise funds in those capital markets because our countries are blacklisted or grey-listed for anti-money laundering, and very often on technical reasons. The last grey listing coming out of the Financial Action Task Force was not because of substantive issues of money laundering, but it was because of a technical reclassification of money supply from M2 to M3, then putting us into a weight category for which we were not prepared. My friends, we have, as small countries, a thin banking system that no money launderer tries to ever lose themselves in, because it is too thin, too small, and too easy to find anything in. Simple. Artificial country ceiling conventions on credit ratings also do not help either, but we know that. Another day for that discussion too. They will tell you that they cannot compete with the state subsidies on developing renewable energy technology, which is being applied in the United States or in Europe or in China, and that the previous tax incentives that partially compensated for the absence of research subsidies are now disallowed in the name of fairness, unless the government wants to be on another blacklist for harmful taxation. Because everything we try to do once we become competitive, list, gray, black, white. That is our reality. And they will tell you that if they come to sell internationally their renewable energy, carbon credits, or anything else, there will be an accreditation process that is more costly for those in developing countries to satisfy, but this is all being done in the name of having a level playing field. It reminds me of the United Nations Charter that preserves the inequity and the discriminatory practices of the world. For if we made everyone equal in 1945, we cemented the inequity of the colonial order as well, in countries and in people. These, not tariffs, not genuine competitiveness and comparative advantages, but these are the obstacles to today's international trade that we face in a real way. And there will be an obstacle too to the efficient and fair prosecution of climate mitigation through the global transfer of capital, technology, and opportunity. The instrument of new colonialism, my friends, is the bypassing of treaty-based organizations to pursue the discriminatory application of non-tariff rules on finance, on tax, and on next-generation standards, all in the name of legitimacy, closed so to, like the green box in agriculture. No scientific basis upon which it can be premised, but simply it is good for some to subsidize to the tune of multiples of their GDP, and the rest of us have to depend on farmers who cannot farm all year, because when we need them for a crisis, they would have already become bankrupt as a result of the glut of cheap goods and produce that comes into our countries. The answer, however, as difficult as it is not to give up on internationalism or multilateralism, not to surrender, not to retreat. The world needs more mobile labor, capital, and technology to defeat the climate crisis. And we need to be part of a digital revolution to deliver better health and better education and a better quality of life. And we need to listen to the voice of labor who represents our citizens, not aliens from Mars. International trade is at the center of solving the climate crisis problem. And the use of digital trade is critical if we are to advance global development. Trade, my friends, as you know better than most people globally, is at the center of all of our profound challenges. And we need the WTO to have a seat at the table to ensure that trade barriers are not blocking our successful attempts to address these challenges. Indeed, might I also remind us that trade is not always good, because I come from a region that was, for its modern existence, settled as a result of trade, but it was called the slave trade. And it took away from us the right to have dignity in our ability to be human. So trade is not always good, but good trade can be secured and settled by this organization. The WTO was born into a world of trade in manufactures and tariffs. It has an inheritance from the GATS that has to be confronted. Confronted if we are to move away from the old colonial order. Confronted if we are to create opportunities for fairness among those countries of the world and those people of the world who need our protection the most. We need to deal with the fact that the world of trade and services and the next generation barriers to trade must be confronted. We need the next generation WTO to be the countervailing force to the discriminatory, distortionary, and inequitable rules and barriers to the international trade and services. And while small groups of countries set up crusades, rules, and standards that others are required to follow, there needs to be a strong representative voice that monitors and values the impact of international trade and speak up in defense of that truly international trade system. Madam Director General, I believe you have that capacity to lead the effort with all of the persons in this room, but it requires the political will To reflect the next generation WTO, I call on this organization to show a reinvigorated defense of an equitable trading system by establishing a high-level committee that asks whether the war on money laundering, the war on tax evasion, the war on the climate crisis, or any of these well-intentioned campaigns have not inadvertently become a war on developing country exporters or a war on small island state exporters. And if so, how can we introduce measures that ensure that we address all of the ailments we are trying to address without prejudicing equitable trade? My message, therefore, to you today is simple, that the stakes have never been higher. Our people are dependent on us more than ever. And that is why I used the words of Bob Marley last year to get up and stand up, because the world must get and be ready to turn its back on the kind of awful behavior that has led to the retreat of internationalism in a misguided pursuit of national security. There is no national security, I should warn, without international security. There is no national security without international security. And there is no international security without an international order that is seen and accepted by most as legitimate, because it is inclusive, it is representative, and it is relevant. At the center of that order, the center of global solutions to global challenges, is equitable international trade. This requires, therefore, that next generation WTO, committed to calling out the obstacles, committed to being even more representative, acting as a countervailing, reforming force against the tendency to narrow exclusive trade relationships, and with a seat at the highest tables to promote the international trade dimension to the world's problems. I believe that this organization, under the new and decisive leadership that it has now, recognizes that we live in a new world and recognizes that we can rise to this point challenge, and we can do better because our people expect better from us. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Your Excellency, Prime Minister Mottley,
Thank you very
WTO
much as well.
DG, Dr. Ngozi, Excellencies, distinguished guests, participants, both attending in person in this room and online, 400 online. So thank you very, very much for your participation online. We're very, very happy. Congratulations, DG. Clearly, this was a very good idea. My name is Atalia Molokomena. I'm the ambassador and permanent representative of Botswana to the UN and the WTO here in Geneva. I'll be moderating the discussion between our guest, Her Excellency, the Prime Minister, the DG, and you, the participants. I'm sure you will all agree that this was a most impressive, if I may say, wide-ranging and thought-provoking lecture, most fitting for the inauguration of the WTO Presidential Lecture Series. Madam Prime Minister, you have certainly set the perfect tone and the bar, I must say, very high, by your very incisive presentation of the issues that so directly impact all of us. I have no doubt that the DG is satisfied that you've done justice to the theme and objective of this high-level series of presidential lectures. So today, I'm truly honored and humbled to be sitting literally, literally between two exceptional leaders, both being phenomenal women, if I may call you that, recognized for their rich knowledge, game-changing ideas, and ability to captivate audiences with clear sound and sometimes sobering messages. I think many of the messages, the Prime Minister, you relate to us were sobering. And I think that many of us will have much to reflect on going forward. Honorable Prime Minister, your words are a wake-up call to us. We have heard you. You have made a clarion call for us to revisit the global order and to go back to the drawing board. It is a call that is up and timely. You said the time is now. It's raining now, you told us. I listened very carefully. You reminded us, especially in this room, of what the WTO was set up to do. You spoke about the next generation WTO. You spoke about a matter not only dear to your heart, but a matter that should be dear to all our hearts, climate crisis. And to go back to Bob Marley again, that's not who feels it knows it, but we should all feel it. So I do believe that these were sobering words indeed. So difficult questions you've asked us. I'm sure those in this room and online will agree. We will mull over these questions. These are not questions we can answer now. But in the meantime, I think I'll do the easy thing and ask a question to the Honorable Prime Minister. The responsibility to take forward, to redefine the global order, Honorable Prime Minister, does it lie first and foremost with world leaders like yourself and the multilateral institutions, or whether it is the individuals, the people in this room and online who have an equal responsibility and role to play?
Thank you. All of the above, plus our citizens. Nothing happens in this world unless there's a mass movement. You only have to look at the bringing down of apartheid. I refer apartheid to apartheid because I was a student in London. I was there when I saw the activism of the young members of the society believe and say we were not prepared to accept decades of discrimination and exploitation any further. And that spawned a movement of young people globally, so that when Mrs. Thatcher and President Reagan refused to yield to the whole issue of sanctions, their populations literally told them where to go. And I think that you are seeing it also with the climate crisis movement, that as many governments that didn't want to look and believe that it was real, it's this ordinary citizens of the world. We saw it also with the Black Lives Matter movement, that once George Floyd was killed, in the glare of the whole world, that people determined that this was unacceptable. And you have a young generation today who perhaps, because they have had the benefit of more things than most generations before them, have the luxury now to focus on conscience. And they are focusing on conscience. They are focusing on what is right, because it is their world that we're mashing up. It is their world that we're taking from them. So that I really believe that it's a combination of the leaders, it's a combination of the international institutions such as this and those of us who work with and in these institutions. But above all else, it is about ordinary citizens claiming ownership of their destiny. And that is why I talk about global moral strategic leadership, not just from the viewpoint of view of governments, but from all of the institutions and individuals that influence our lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your response and guidance, Prime Minister. Very practical, I'm sure examples steeped in history, apartheid, and now the movements you have referred to. TG, if I may turn to you and ask you the same question. I know you will be ready with an answer. Who, in your view, bears ultimate responsibility for reshaping the global order?
Well, first of all, I didn't know you were going to ask me any questions. I think people here have my time to listen to me, so I was hoping the Prime Minister will do all the work today. But seriously, I couldn't agree with the Prime Minister more. When you say who bears responsibility, I always start by saying responsibility starts with you. It starts with you, it starts with me. Most of the time in the world, when something needs to change, we are looking for who is going to change it for us. And I always say, you have to be the change you wish. So if you want something to change, ask yourself first, what can I do to make this happen? Never believe that as an individual you have no power. I just don't believe that. As an individual, you have the power to change something. And you also have the power to get others to help you change things. So those who look to the leaders all the time, oh, I can't do this unless the government does that, or unless my leaders do that, I say to them, no. Start by, what can I do? Maybe by your very action and your ability to mobilize others to act, you can make your leaders listen. Thank you.
If I may, I think that with all that's going on in the world, and Ngozi, you'll forgive me, please, but this morning you said something to me that has stayed with me all day. And that is that you know what it is to have gone through a war. That as a child living, you lived through a war for 3 years between the ages of 12 and 15. And sometimes, and I'm not asking you to obviously give personal testimony in any long way, but I think that you have endured and succeeded is the greatest inspiration that we can give to every boy, girl, man, woman out there, because people just need to know that their individual agency can make that difference in the world. And if they do, then what your advice that you've commended to us is the same one that I live by as well, and that we can jointly commend to the rest of the world that, look, you have to believe as well as do. You have to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. And that's true talk.
Thank you so much, PM, and thank you, DG. I knew you would have an answer, and it was a really great answer. And once again, the personal is political. This is why the Honorable Prime Minister has raised the issue of Dr. Ngozi's own personal experience. And you've raised, DG, the matter of agency, personal agency. Let me now turn to you, the audience, and see if you have any questions for Prime Minister Mottley. As you are aware, the lecture is live streamed. We don't have too much time, but the reason we are having these lectures is so that you can also pose questions to our guest. We are only able to offer the floor, I'm afraid, to those present in the room. So I sincerely apologize to our many participants online. For those who like to pose a question, please raise your hand so I can identify you. The Secretariat will assist in identifying you. You will speak from your seat using the microphone in front of you. When you do so, please introduce yourself. Be short and concise. So colleagues, no statements, please. It's meant to be an interactive engagement. We love our statements, but today, let's loosen up a bit. Friends and colleagues in the room, forgive me then. Once again, raise your hand and thereafter introduce yourselves. And so now that the rules are set, let me have a look and see whether we have. I see a hand over there. I don't see who you are. Please introduce yourself. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. My name is Maria, and I'm from the Permanent Mission of Ukraine. I would like to thank Prime Minister for sharing her observations, and we would like to completely agree that as delegates here in Geneva, and also the world and international institutions are faced with unprecedented challenges and those that threaten our peace, security, and development. Russia's military aggression on Ukraine, if not stopped, will lead to horrific humanitarian and global food crisis. Actions of Russia and ongoing attacks also lead to contamination of war, air, and land. Ukraine and its neighboring countries have already witnessed one of the worst environmental crises in their modern history, the explosion of Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and we cannot let anything similar happen again. As eloquently highlighted by the Prime Minister, the potential reduction of GDP growth in several parts of the world, among other caused by the war, will reduce the availability of funds for development, in particular if military expenses increase globally, and that worries us a lot. Ukraine believes in the multilateral trading system, and in times of crisis, we think that the system and the WTO at its core can provide benefits and deliver solutions. We hope for support and solidarity of all countries to mobilize all possible resources and tools to stop the Russian aggression immediately. Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Thank you very much. People need to talk. People need to sit down and talk in a meaningful way, because the issue is not one-sided in any way, but equally two wrongs never make a right. The first thing that has to happen is that we need to save lives from the humanitarian crisis as well as from the military aspect. But the second thing is that we must also recognize that large powers are not going to easily agree to people putting threats against them, as we saw with the Bay of Pigs in the 1960s. And regrettably, what is not happening is sufficient dialogue and conversation. And that is what is at risk. And I pray, as all of us do, that the suffering that we are seeing on our televisions will stop there, just as I pray it will stop in Afghanistan, just as I pray it will stop in Syria, just as I pray it will stop in all of the other areas of conflict across the world. Equally, I also pray that we recognize that this world in which we live, where people believe that everything can be reduced to a 60-second soundbite or to 4 column inches, be put one side for the purpose of understanding that true, genuine dialogue must mean something. And the last point I make is this: our populations must also be told that principles only mean something when it is inconvenient to stand by them. You cannot say that it is wrong, but still continue to trade in areas where the trade is taking place. And obviously, there are consequences, but most countries do not want to bear the consequences of the cessation of trade, but want to bear the honor of speaking from a pulpit. The two do not equate. And therefore, I hope that people will step back from the precipice where the world currently is now, and to recognize that we do not have the power of the gods to create life or to create a new planet.
Thank you, PM, for your response. I'm trying, the room is full. So I've had one question from there. So I saw a hand on my left, and I'm going to ask you to come in now, and then I'll go right again. You have the floor. Please identify yourself. Introduce yourself.
Thank you, Teutagai Demiaha, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of North Macedonia. Madam Prime Minister, today you shared your views on reinventing the global order. Having in mind your powerful leadership and outstanding contribution for gender equality, do you believe that such transformed global order is possible without full worldwide empowerment of women? Thank you.
Of course, we believe in the full worldwide empowerment of women, but we also recognize that what we face didn't get there overnight, and it's not going to be cured overnight. It is good that we've seen in the last century, century and a half, a serious opportunity and pathway for women. What is not as good is that it is still too narrow and too much at the top, without giving ordinary women the power of choice. The ability to say yes and no is the most powerful thing that we can give a human being. There are too many girls and too many women who do not still have that power today. And therefore, that must motivate us all to vest in them that right. Do I believe that it will happen in 10, 20, 30 years? Probably not. But, you know, the Talmud says that we are not we're not expected to complete the task, but neither are we at liberty to resile from it. So we shall continue to fight the battle for gender equality.
Thank you, PM. Thank you very much. Here at the WTO, we do have an informal working group on gender, so we are also fighting for gender equality. I just wanted that to be on record.
I think that the answer from this platform may not necessarily look as appropriate as it should.
side, and I'm going to ask gentlemen over there to come in. Please pose your question.
Thank you, Madam Prime Minister. This is Sri Nitya Moksha Priyananda. I represent the Kailasa Nation. And my question was this. Are the countries that are claiming discrimination by the bigger powers doing enough when they are dealing with the smaller countries or smaller sets of peoples and discrimination within their own boundaries or people they deal with? Should the group of countries that are not at the top of this digital world and so on do more to get together and be fair in their dealings with their peoples as well as smaller countries?
I'm not sure who you're referring to, but if I were to assume that you're referring to emerging market countries, then there's always room for all of us to do better. And there's always room for all of us to do better, not only internationally, but locally. Look, my government just won, as you heard, all of the seats. But that does not mean that I feel that my government has been able to satisfy the needs of all of our people, because I don't feel so. In fact, only last week I introduced a new component in our budget speech. And I hope that it is new ground that we're breaking, but ground that we can deliver. And that is, none of us owns the sun, the sea, the wind. And if we're therefore talking about renewable energy, then the first obligation of a government, in my view, is to ensure that all of its citizens, through the householders at least, be given the opportunity to own a piece of that action in renewable energy, because it is the patrimony of the nation and it doesn't belong to a handful of people. So that last week we announced that we would use the renewable energy as a democratizing and an empowering first force for our own population, so that every Barbadian homeowner will, as of right, have access to either solar or small wind turbines to power their homes and to be able to sell back power to the grid. Now, I do that in a country of 300,000 people with just under 100,000 households, and I do so conscious that we only announced it last week. So if you asked me that question 6 months ago, then someone might equally have said that I have not done enough. Our government has not done enough for our people too. So the relativity prevents me from being able to answer that question in the way that you might want me to. But suffice it to say that we have to continue to strive to put people at the center of all that we do. It sounds trite, it sounds cliche, but regrettably, it is necessary because it is not happening globally. And that is why you heard me in my speech refer to the absolute need for the dialogue with labor and other entities and small developing countries, because we feel as though we are on the outside all the time, and we feel as though we're jumping up high to make noises, but that those who need to listen are not necessarily listening in the way that we need them to. So can we do more? Yes. Can the larger developing countries in particular do more? Absolutely. And must we stand together in solidarity as the labor movement has taught us? Absolutely.
Thank you, PM. There's a hand in the back there. I promised you'd come in, and then we'll go to the same side of the room, and I'll move to the right.
Boris Engelson, can you hear me? Journalist freelance. Madam Prime Minister, the standing ovation at the end of your address showed that you said a lot of things that people in this room wanted to hear. Is there anything, at least one thing, you have to say which you assume people in this room do not want to hear?
That if ever there was a time that you need to go back to your capitals and tell them stop playing the fool, it is now. That we need a mandate, we need the political will, and we need to see movement. And I say so genuinely. Madam Chair, you head up the dispute settlement body. I didn't get to speak to it. But it is an absolute travesty that an international organization founded in the rule of law cannot have the expression of the rule of law as part of its deliberations. And nothing short of the urgent repair of that situation will be satisfactory if we are going to see movement from the rest of us in this multilateral trading system.
Thank you, DG. I think our work is cut out for us on dispute settlement. One more hand I saw in the corner there, and I'll come back to the right side. You have the floor.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for a highly insightful lecture. You spoke about the need for treaty-based organizations to move from the colonial legacy of to a more transparent and truly representative based structure representing the world today. In practical terms, how do you suggest that the WTO and other treaty-based organizations can move towards a more representative order? My name is Kabo Abama, International Trade Law at the Graduate Institute, Geneva.
Thank you. Part of the difficulty lies in a very human condition that those who pay the piper call the tune. And regrettably, that is not going to work if we are going to have a stable world, because it gives people the feeling that they can have a disproportionate influence, even if that influence is contrary to principles. If the influence could be isolated from the breach of principles and the breach of treaty, then it could work. And then it would be viewed as we view all of our tithing and contributions in religious organizations as a benevolent exercise and not one that is intended to achieve a disproportionate advantage. And it hasn't happened. I can't tell you that we know the exact route to it. But what I do know is that the embalming of the old colonial order cannot be the way of the future.
PM, thank you. Thank you very much for your answer. I'm going to take two more from this side because our time is moving on. I see a hand here. You want to come in with your question? And I see, yes.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't too sure if you were referring to me. So my name is Curleen Wills. I'm the Chargé d'Affaires for the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. And I want to thank you, PM Mottley, for your very candid and powerful lecture. I think you touched on some very important issues for us, not only as CARICOM, but as Guyana. So I also wanted to say how incredibly powerful it is for me personally to see three Black women seated here. Three very powerful Black women in very different spaces. It just highlights the importance of how representation matters. So my question is, given the multilateral fora and some of the things that you talked about, and even in the present day, as developing countries, it seems that our economics are so different, but sometimes we face some similar challenges. So how as developing countries would you recommend that we can kind of come together to address some of the issues that you highlighted in your lecture? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your warm words to all of us. And we hope that we can inspire others to continue to represent. On the issue of working together, because that's really what it is. You know, in a family, not everybody wants to eat the same thing every day. But we compromise because we understand the practicality of the distribution of work or the need to be able to spend money in a practical way. And that's why I keep coming back to what we do at the individual level, because the power of individual agency is so tremendous, and it ought to inspire us to do the right thing. I see the people representative here, and I thank him. It's good to see you again. I continue to be inspired by many of our religious leaders globally, because much of what the world needs now has to be rooted in justice and morality. And I think that if we start from that premise and we recognize that we cannot do all things at once, then it becomes easier for the developing countries to settle on what are the hierarchy of needs that must be confronted. There is no doubt in my mind that the two that I addressed this evening are critical. And a WTO that does not relate to the climate crisis will be an irrelevant organization, because trade is a critical part of solving the climate crisis. And a WTO that does not address the consolidation of power, economic power and real power in multinational corporations that are at the center of the digital empire will also become an irrelevant institution. And the reality is that if those are the two most compelling things affecting our citizens, then developing countries ought to say, okay, what will it take for us to agree on those absolute measures to be able to avert the climate crisis and to stop the migration that will follow naturally from the floods and the droughts and the hurricanes? And what will it take for us equally to be able to empower our people? The digital tool has helped us to democratize, but it has also been a source of fake news. It's also been a source of instability. It has also been a source of consolidation. So how do we identify the 3 or 4 most important things that we need to resolve with respect to the encroachment of the digital revolution? And how do we stop the climate crisis? Then we go to food. Without food and water, we have nothing. And unless we can ensure that every human being in this world has the right to a meal, then we have not satisfied our obligations either as citizens or as nation states. And I therefore hope that those 3 things, energy is just the means by which we do what we have to do. Transport is just the means by which we do what we have to do. But if we can solve the climate crisis, if we can restrain the digital empire from being a negative force, but only used for good, and if we can ensure that people have access to food and water, and by extension, health and education, then that is what should motivate us. When we start to worry about profit over people, that's when we get in trouble.
Thank you so very much, Prime Minister. I think it really remains for me to thank both of you, PM and DG. I'm sure there's lots of interest from others who wanted to ask questions, but we have to end it here. Let me congratulate the Prime Minister for your willingness to inaugurate the series, for doing it with such flair, conviction, and insight. We are totally in awe. I think you've left some powerful messages. DG, congratulations for your unique and exciting initiative launched today. It is not actually my duty to thank. I'm going to ask my brother, the PM wants to say something.
Just to say thank you, and I forgot one thing.
Okay.
Ngozi, when we asked you to be a member of the CARICOM Commission on Economy, we also asked Pascal Lamy. And little did we know that on that small commission on the economy, we would have 2 directors general of the WTO. That perhaps says it all for small island developing states, that without good trade, without functional trade, we will be nothing, because no man is an island, but equally no island is the world. So we thank you for your continued commitment to the Caribbean community.
Yeah, I'm conscious of the fact that we have to wrap up because we had promised to end at 5:30. But we have Ambassador Blackman coming. I just wanted to say what a pleasure. I thought we would have a profound lecture, an electrifying one, and you didn't disappoint. Thank you so much for kicking off with such a wonderful lecture, and one that is thought-provoking. Thank you.
Ambassador Blackman, my brother, you have the floor, Your Excellency.
Thank you, colleague, Excellency. The Honorable Mayor Amor Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados and distinguished lecturer, for this wonderful and inaugural WTO Presidential Lecture Series, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, our Director General of this House, Her Excellency and my sister, Dr. Talia Molokome, the Ambassador of Botswana in Geneva, and of course, our moderator for this historic event, heads of international organizations, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm both honored and humbled to have been tasked with the expression of a few words to you thanking you for making this inaugural event a huge success. Let me start firstly by thanking the WTO Director General, Dr. Ngozi, for her foresight and her vision, which clearly has become synonymous with her leadership in conceptualizing this presidential series as a platform for visionary leaders, revolutionary policymakers, as you've seen this evening, and innovators to share their ideas, knowledge, and experiences with international Geneva, and by extension, the global community. Her opening remarks painted a vivid picture of Prime Minister Mottley and set the perfect backdrop for this historic event. It certainly would be remiss of me, certainly as a UN International Gender Champion, not to remark on the fact that we have our inaugural presidential lecture in the WTO, 3 powerful intellectual women and leaders who have really set the tone this evening, and kudos must be given to them. I would like to thank the Honorable Prime Minister, not just because she's my Prime Minister. Yes, and my boss. For what I can only describe as a refreshing, thought-provoking, and electrifying lecture, a topic that is not only apt, given the plethora of challenges that the global community is facing today, but one that is also necessary if we are to give the moral strategic leadership that is required at the global level and to ensure that this organization remains faithful to its mandate, and I repeat, remains faithful to its mandate, as well as find common ground on the type of outcomes that will lead to a strengthened organization that responds to the needs and also interests for all, including those that are smaller and vulnerable. If today's lecture is the benchmark for this to come, I believe that this presidential lecture series will achieve all that is promised. The lecture would not have been complete, of course, without our moderator, my sister, Ambassador of Botswana, Ambassador Molokome, for her expert leadership during this event. Ambassador, we thank you. Heads of international organizations in Geneva, particularly the Director General of the United Nations Office at Geneva, Ms. Tatiana Vulovaya, Director General of the World Health Organization, who's had to slip out, Dr. Tedros, and of course, our Secretary General at UNCTAD, Ms. Rebecca Greenspan, who also had to leave earlier. I wish to express gratitude for your continued support and your presence here today. This is a true and tangible expression of what partnership must and look like. I also want to express, finally, ladies and gentlemen, thanks to the Federal Council and the Canton of Geneva for their presence today. Of course, none of this would be possible without International Geneva, ambassadors, distinguished delegates, and specifically invited guests, including those of you here in the room and those viewing online. I wish to thank you for your kind words and your attentiveness. And allow me to thank the entire staff. DG, you have a good staff. You have a good staff. Thank the staff at the WTO Secretariat for their tireless work in collaboration. And I can tell you, both our teams worked tirelessly together over the last few weeks to really make this possible. And I must say that they really worked really well in ensuring that we got here. And therefore, a tremendous mechanism was deployed in ensuring that this was a success. I would, however, like to single out a few persons, namely the Director General's Chief of Staff, Mr. Bright Okogu, and senior advisors, Ambassador Eloi Leroux, Ambassador Stephen Fevrier, former ambassador of the OECS, and Mr. Bernard Coutin, Head of External Relations, and his team, Director Werner and his division. And finally, I wish to thank the Barbados delegation who would have traveled with the Prime Minister. Of course, we have 2 ministers here with us today, 3 permanent secretaries. Many of you would have met Minister Walker, who is the Vice Chair of the MC12. And this is certainly a plug for us to continue to build that momentum towards MC12. But we also have our Minister of Labor, Colin Jordan, and we have a Member of Parliament, Tony Moore, who is also the head of our largest trade union in our country, Barbados Workers Union. And ladies and gentlemen, simply to say thanks to all of you. Once again, to Director General for your leadership, your vision, Prime Minister Mottley for your truly inspiring and historic words at a historic time in our world affairs, and Ambassador of Botswana. To all of you, thank you very much.
Thank you. We have come to the end, Excellencies, Prime Minister, DG, interpreters. We should thank them. They work so hard. Thank you to everybody for joining us. Merci, thank you, and goodbye.